we begin with our first keynote speaker of the day, who is Astrid De Wit. Astrid De Wit, whom I'd like to thank for accepting to be a keynote speaker for this conference. Astrid De Wit has been a tenure-track assistant professor in English linguistics at the University of Antwerp, Anvers, since 2018. Her thesis title was The Present Perfective Paradox Across Languages, okay, which was published a couple years later in 2017, I think, in Oxford, at Oxford University Press. And in this book, which I personally found fascinating and very insightful and very, very interesting, she provides a cognitive constructional account of the present perfective across several languages: English, Slavic, Sranan, which is a language I didn't know about before I read you. Astrid has also contributed to lots of journal articles on the progressive aspect in particular, on performatives too. She has done joint work with many people, many linguists, among whom Franck Brizard, Laura Michaelis, Peter Petré, among others. I noted also in her publication a work on the use of aspect in inversions in English, which is a topic not often treated in literature, which was an interesting, very interesting topic. And she has been invited to many, many conferences. And she is now invited to this conference. And the title for Astrid's talk is, as you may have guessed already, The Present Perfective Paradox Across Languages. Okay, Astrid, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Eric, for your very kind words. Thank you also for inviting me. It's really an honor to be able to present my work here, surrounded by so many eminent aspectual scholars. And let me also seize this opportunity to thank the organizers for setting this up, because it doesn't often happen that a conference is entirely devoted to aspect. So let me share my PowerPoint with you and get started. There you go. Do you see it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So yes, as Eric already announced, the title of my talk is The Present Perfective Paradox Across Languages, and this is indeed also the title of my 2017 book. So what I'm basically going to do in this talk is give you a summary of this book with some additions here and there. So what is on the agenda? I'm first going to introduce a couple of examples, so some cross-linguistic observations on the peculiar patterns that the present tense can enter into. And then I'll be introducing and defining this infamous present perfective paradox, although Tassos already did so yesterday to a great extent. And then I will discuss a number of solutions that different languages have developed in order to overcome this present perfective paradox. And in doing so, I will be harking back to the examples that I will be discussing first. But so first, the examples. And given the theme of this conference, I thought I would start with some examples from Slavic languages. But I know this is a session that is also devoted to English, so I promise I will be talking more about English as well. But so first, Slavic. As many of you know, so there are many experts in Slavic linguistics in this audience. And as many of you know, there are important differences when it comes to aspect marking between the different geographical branches of Slavic languages. What is typically done is, well, people typically make a distinction between Eastern and Western Slavic languages and between North and South Slavic In this talk, I will only be making a distinction between North and South, not because East and West doesn't matter or because the differences are irrelevant, but simply because I really won't have the time to go into the intricacies of these differences. So what do we see in Northern Slavic languages such as Russian? We see that the construction, the present tense, when present tense inflection combines with imperfective verbs, as is illustrated in one. I don't know if you can see the arrow or not. If not, doesn't matter. I'm pointing you to example 1 here. So if you combine this present tense with an imperfective verb, you get a present tense interpretation, and this is pretty natural. But if you combine the same present tense inflection with a perfective verb, as in to, here perfectivity is marked by the prefix u, you do not get a present interpretation. What you typically get is a future interpretation. This has already been hinted at yesterday in various talks, I think. So apart from this future reading, what you also get for present perfective verbs in especially Western, Northwestern Slavic languages is realis conditional cases, historical presence, some habitual, some performatives in limited contexts, and these contexts are even more limited in languages such as Russian. So the more we move to the east, the more limited these cases become. If we then move to the south, we see something very similar. So in a language like Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, you can also use a present tense with an imperfective verb to refer to the present, to the time of speaking. But again, you cannot use this inflection in combination with a perfective verb to refer to the present. And in fact, you cannot use it either to refer to the future. What we see in South Slavic languages, and especially in Eastern Southeastern Slavic languages, is a fairly restricted use of present perfectives. So you find some habitual uses where when you focus on individual sub-events, and borrowing terminology from Stephen Dickey, which I think is very useful, what you could say is that when you would adopt a micro perspective on this habit, so when you look, for instance, at an example like every morning he gets up at 11, he checks his email, and then he pours his coffee, there you might get a present perfective construal when you focus on the individual sub-events. You can also get something similar in narrative contexts and demonstrations, and again, this non-counterfactual conditional context. So, but overall, uses are fairly restricted in of the present perfective in South Slavic. So what we see overall in Slavic languages is that if you want to refer to the present, if you want to refer to present time situations, you need to use a present imperfective. And the present perfective can be used for a great many different things, notably future time reference in Northern Slavic, but it cannot be used for present time reference, which is, if you think about it, actually kind of strange for a construction that calls itself a present tense. So with half of the verbs, you cannot use it to refer to the present. But if we broaden our scope a little bit and look at other languages, we see that this interaction is, well, the examples from Slavic are in fact not that isolated. And let's move on to English then. Because what do we see in English? In English, the simple present can again be used for a great many different things, but ironically, it cannot be used to report present time events, barring a few exceptional contexts. So you cannot say in English, please be quiet, I give a talk, or please be quiet, I sleep. That is ungrammatical. Only with stative verbs can you use the simple present to refer to the time of speaking. As in 7, I understand what you're saying. Typically, the interpretation you get when a dynamic verb, such as give or sleep, does combine with a simple present is a habitual or a generic reading. I sleep as much as I can, or human beings sleep. That is the typical reading of our simple present in combination with dynamic verbs. If you do want to refer to the present with a dynamic verb, you need to use a progressive. This is obligatory in present-day English. Please be quiet. I am giving a talk, or please be quiet. I am sleeping. So to drive the point home, what you see in English is, again, something peculiar if you think about it. The present tense is, with the majority of the verbs, not used for present time reference. And if we broaden our scope just a little bit more and cross the Atlantic to this language that Eric already hinted at in his introduction to Sranan, we see again something relatively similar. So Sranan or Sranan-Tongo is a Creole language which is spoken in Suriname. And the most important substrate languages of Sranan, so these are the languages from which it has borrowed most of its structure, are the West African Bay languages. And the most important superstrate languages of Sranan, so these are its lexifier languages from which it has borrowed most of its vocabulary, are English and, to a lesser extent, Dutch and Portuguese. Now, what I'm going to say about Sranan holds for many Creole languages, and more specifically for many English-based Atlantic Creole languages. In Sranan, as in other Creoles, tense and aspect are marked by means of a set of preverbal markers. So an important one, which I'll come back to later, is ben, which is used to refer to the past or to past before past situations. We have two future tense markers, o and sa. We have a progressive habitual marker, e, and a completive marker, kpa. Now, crucially, verbs in finite clauses can also remain unmarked, in which case we say they are marked by 0. And if we look at some examples of 0, we see again that with stative verbs, present time reference is natural. So in example 10, san mi wanitaki ovra briefi, what I want to say about the letter, you see that the 0 marked stative verb wani gets a present interpretation, and I glossed 0 as indicating present. I will defend this present tense analysis later on. I promise. Stay tuned. But if you combine this 0 with a dynamic verb, you again do not get a present time reading. You get typically past time reference, as is illustrated in 11 for the verbs fall and see. Other interpretations are available as well. You find 0-marked dynamic verbs in historical present context, present perfect context, and non-counterfactual conditional context. But actual present time reference is only attested with stative verbs. Of course, you can refer to the present with dynamic verbs, but then you have to use this progressive habitual marker, e, as is illustrated in 12. You can see these data come from elicitation tasks. It's important to observe that this pattern that we find in Sranan is not restricted to Creole languages and not restricted to 0 markers. We find this with overt grammatical markers in other languages as well. For instance, Bantu languages such as Lingala. In 13 and 14, you can see the same pattern. So e, suffix e, gets a stative present reading with stative verbs and a perfect or a past reading with dynamic verbs. So those of you who speak French, and there are many native speakers of French among you, some of us, including myself, are native speakers of Dutch, and there are some native speakers of German here as well. And you may have wondered, well, what about my language? You know, in my language, I can use a simple present to report present time events, and that's true. For instance, in French, you can say, je mange en ce moment. Literally, you're saying, I eat at this moment. I am eating at this moment. So what we see in these languages is that the use of the present tense to report present time events is not problematic, and you do not have to use a progressive in these languages. And I can talk for hours about the kinds of contexts that you will be using the progressive for in these languages, but I don't have the time to go into that. So that's something, well, also peculiar, perhaps. So if we now we get to a brief summary of what I've just been saying. So what we see in many different languages is that the form that is used to refer to the present with imperfective or stative verbs is not used to refer to the present with perfective or dynamic verbs, and instead another meaning arises. And Dutch and French and some other languages are exceptions in this respect. If we broaden our scope even a little bit further, we see that these patterns are not restricted to the languages that I just discussed. So here I'm referring to ongoing work by Tom Koss, my doctoral student, who is looking into these patterns from a typological perspective. And we see that there are a great many languages that pattern like Lingala and Sranan. So languages such as the Niger-Congo languages, Yoruba and Igbo, or the Sino-Tibetan language, Meitei, or many Southeast Asian languages, for that matter, do the same thing. So they assign a past interpretation to a present tense construction in combination with dynamic or perfective verbs. Languages such as Somali or Lithuanian pattern in the same way as English. So a habitual or a generic reading is assigned to a present tense when combined with a dynamic or perfective viewpoint. And we find also many languages where a future reading is assigned to present perfective verbs. This is the case in Japanese or in Finnish, where aspect is marked through partitive or accusative object marking. The Dravidian language Kannada, Sanuma spoken in South America, or Lakota, a native Northern American language. So just to show you that this is not an isolated pattern. But in my talk, I will only be zooming in on Slavic languages, on English, on Sranan, and I will say towards the end a little bit about French as well. And what I will be arguing is that the attested patterns are the result of the same, and I dare say universal, cognitive constraint, the present perfective paradox. Now, the term present perfective paradox is a term that I stole from Andrei Malchikov, who used it to refer to what he calls the infelicitous combination of the categories perfective aspect and present tense. Now, in order to explain why these two categories should be incompatible, we of course need to define these categories first. So what does a present tense do? It indicates roughly coincidence with the time of speaking. On the other hand, perfective aspect indicates a full conceptualization of a situation. So it indicates that a situation can be conceived of in its entirety. Imperfective aspect, on the other hand, indicates an internal perspective on a situation. Now, what happens if we combine the two? And in order to illustrate what happens, I'm going to use some diagrams that look a little bit like, or look a lot maybe like the diagrams used by Lanneker in his theory of cognitive grammar. So what you see here is a timeline, and this boxed squiggly line is the time of speaking, and above that you see a bounded event. Now, the present tense, as I said, indicates coincidence with the time of speaking. So you could say the present tense imposes a temporal immediate scope, which we call IST, which indicates, again, coincidence with the time of speaking. Perfective aspect, then, also indicates, also imposes its own scope, an aspectual scope. And as I said, it indicates that a situation is conceived of in its entirety. So in fact, this aspectual scope coincides with the temporal scope imposed by the present tense. So this would be the configuration of a present perfective tense. Now let's see how this configuration works when we apply it to different types of verb. So again, a situation referred to by means of a present perfective tense needs to be fully conceptualizable at the time of speaking. What happens if we use such a present perfective construal with a stative verb? Well, in fact, there are no problems there. And why should this be so? Because states have an important property, which is called the contractability property, or in formal semantic terms, the subinterval property of states. States are construed as homogeneous and unbounded, so they do not change over time. The way I dislike shrimps now is the same as way in which I will be liking this shrimps in an hour from now, or in the way I disliked them last night. What this basically means is that every segment of a state is the same as the state in its entirety. So this means that we can conceive of an entire state on the basis of a signal of any random segment of a state. So what we get here we have a state, we impose a present perfective viewpoint on that state, and that part that is within the scope of our present perfective is representative for the entire state. So we do not get any compatibility issues here, which may sound maybe counterintuitive, but a present perfective construal of a state is not problematic. However, with events, we do get a problem. Events are by definition not contractible. In order for you to be able to identify that I am giving a talk, I already need to have started giving this talk, and you need more than just a snapshot, more than just a sample to be able to identify that I am actually what I'm doing. I'm not asking a question, I am giving a talk. And I think Laura Michaelis comes up with some very illuminating examples to explain this non-contractable nature of events. In one of her papers, she says, for instance, in order to identify the difference between nodding off for a second, or sleeping, or being comatose, cannot be made on the basis of just a random snapshot. You need to know more about how long this person is lying down. So what you get with events is a bit of a problematic configuration. You cannot impose a present perfective viewpoint entailing a full conceptualization of an event at the time of speaking. This is what I try to depict here. Here you see events that have already started or that go on after the time of speaking and that are heterogeneous. However, as I just showed you, there are languages which have present perfective tenses which combine with events. So these combinations do exist. And so the question is why? How can we account for this? And this brings me to the third part of this talk, namely the solutions that languages have developed in order to address this semantic conflict that I just tried to explain to you. The first type of solution is to assign a non-present reading to a present perfective construction. And this is how we end up in this paradoxical situation where a present perfective tense is not used to refer to the present. And the second solution, which is complementary to the first one, so it doesn't exclude the first one, is to use a present imperfective or a progressive construction, which does allow coincidence with the present. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to zoom in on these two types of solutions, and I'm going to start with the first one. And this brings me back to the cross-linguistic, well, the rough cross-linguistic overview I gave you at the beginning of this talk. Basically, we can discern three strategies when it comes to this assigned non-present interpretation. We get a retrospective strategy, where languages defer present perfective situations to the past. We get a structural strategy, in which case languages assign a habitual or generic interpretation. For South Slavic, this is very limited, I know, but for the other languages, it's more common. So in those languages, we get a structural strategy. And then we have languages where we get a prospective strategy. So these are the languages in which the combination of a present perfective viewpoint on an event yields a future reading. Now, if you look at this overview, you might have two questions, or you may have a great many questions by now, but I think two questions pop up immediately. Well, first of all, why should a given language adopt a given strategy? Why, for instance, do Creole languages adopt a retrospective strategy, whereas a language such as Russian adopts a prospective strategy? And secondly, and maybe more importantly so, how can I prove that these different patterns are in fact different strategies, and that these strategies are all reflections of this present perfective paradox? So they arose in reaction to a semantic incompatibility problem. In order to prove that, I would have to show that we're indeed dealing with present perfective tenses in all of these cases. Now, I won't be going to all of these cases. I will be answering these two questions with regard, again, to Slavic, English, and Suriname. So to repeat, in order to demonstrate that the present perfective paradox is indeed arising in languages such as Slavic, English, and Suriname, and that it is indeed responsible for the attested patterns, the attested strategies, we need to be able to show that we're indeed dealing with present perfective tenses in these languages. And secondly, we need to explain why a particular retrospective, structural, or prospective strategy should have been chosen. And in order to explain that, I will have to resort to language, mostly language internal explanations. So in the next slides, I will be addressing these two questions, first for Slavic, then for English, and then for Suriname. So the first issue is, are we indeed dealing with present perfective markers? For Slavic, such an analysis is in fact not that straightforward. A perfective analysis is, of course, relatively straightforward because we're dealing with perfective verbs. But the present tense analysis is not that straightforward, given the entrenched future reading of this present perfective in North Slavic. But I agree with many people before me who argue that we are indeed dealing with the present tense. Well, why? Well, morphologically, this is still a present tense. It is used with imperfective verbs to refer to the time of speaking. It's a present tense. Historically, it's a present tense as well, and non-future readings still make up for about 40% of all the instances of these this construction, of all the uses of this construction. And this holds for Russian. So in a language such as Czech, it'll be even more. So it would be well, calling it a future tense wouldn't be quite correct either. So I think we have strong arguments to say we're dealing with present tense in this case. And then the second question is, why should North Slavic have adopted a prospective strategy and South Slavic a structural strategy to some extent? As for North Slavic, at the time when the present perfective paradox arose, so this was when in Proto-Slavic the affix system, the aspectual system, prefix system became fully productive, and verbs started to be systematically marked for perfectivity or imperfectivity, and you would get the semantic clash between our original present tense and perfective verbs. At that time, the present tense was already commonly used to refer to the future. And so this meaning only got strengthened because the other meanings weren't available anymore. So this rise of the future meaning is only a function in the mathematical sense of the disappearance of other uses. And also, it didn't really make sense to develop a retrospective strategy in North Slavic because there were already two grammaticalized past tenses. So a move to the past would not make sense. As for South Slavic, the prospective strategy is not available in these languages. So recall, you do not get a future reading for present perfectives. And why is this? Because South Slavic languages have dedicated periphrastic future tense constructions, which can be used both with perfective and imperfective verbs. In North Slavic, this periphrastic future can only combine with imperfective verbs. So the future slot is filled. Again, the retrospective strategy isn't likely either for the same reasons as for North Slavic. So the only strategy left was basically the structural strategy. But part of that habitual domain is already taken up by imperfective aspects. So there's just not much left for South Slavic. And this may be the same for Greek. In South Slavic, what we see is that the present perfective can only be used with situations that you may call non-actual. So they're not actually happening at the time of speaking. They didn't actually happen in the past, and they're not projected as going to happen in the future. These sub-events of habits, some historical present context, some instructions. And of course, the conditionals. All right, let's move on to English then. Here, the present tense analysis for a simple present is less contested, but not everyone will agree with an analysis of the simple present in terms of perfectivity. In another paper, we demonstrate that the simple present has evolved into a present perfective construction under pressure from the heavily grammaticalized progressive. So the progressive started to eat away all the imperfective contexts in which the simple present could occur, leaving the simple present with only those contexts in which, well, it took on a perfective meaning, namely in those contexts in which a full and exact coincidence with the time of speaking wasn't an issue. So a full conceptualization of a situation at the time of speaking wasn't an issue. We saw that with states, there are no such issues, but also with some events, such as performatives, you can still use a simple present because these events are also fully and instantly identifiable at the time of speaking. So I really think we're dealing with a present perfective here. And then the second question is, why should English have adopted the structural strategy? Again, we get an explanation that is very similar to what we see for North Slavic. The habitual and the generic meaning had always been part of the semantics of the English simple present, but the more other uses became infelicitous as a result of this progressive that is grammaticalizing, the habitual and generic meaning got strengthened. A prospective strategy, a future reading was also part of the semantics of the simple present in older stages. Still, the prospective strategy was less likely given the fact that will and shall had grammaticalized at the time the present perfective paradox arose. And the retrospective strategy was not available in the first place because the past had never been part of the semantics of the simple present. And you have a simple past tense as well. Then as for Sranam, here a perfective analysis is not uncontested. In fact, many people argue that zero and related constructions such as this E suffix in Lingala is a perfective marker. But in doing so, they basically shuffle the present time reading of states a little bit under the carpet. They're considered exceptions to this general perfective meaning. I think if you want to come up with a more unified account of the semantics of zero and related markers in other languages, it makes sense to say we're dealing with a present perfective. Even if I acknowledge with events, you typically get a past reading, but there is a crucial distinction between zero-marked dynamic verbs in Sranam and verbs that are preceded by the real past tense marker ben, in that there's still some connection with the present for zero-marked dynamic verbs. Ben, on the other hand, really indicates a break with the present. So for instance, if you're talking about a picture of a house that's been torn down and you want to talk about the house and who built the house and so on, you need to use ben because there's a clear break with the present. The house is no longer there. So we're always in the realm of the present when we use zero. And then why should Sranam have adopted the retrospective strategy? Well, the easy answer is it inherited this retrospective strategy from its substrate languages, the West African Bay languages, remember? However, you might ask then, yeah, but why did these West African languages use a retrospective strategy in the first place? And there, I think an answer might lie in an observation made by Smith and Erbau in a paper on Mandarin Chinese, and they argue that the retrospective strategy is could be default because cognitively it makes most sense to talk about bounded situations as being past. This is also what people have argued who use the term factative for these kinds of markers. Factative is a term that Vladimir Plungian was referring to yesterday as well. So it may indeed be the case that the retrospective strategy is the default strategy and will be attested most commonly, and this seems indeed to be the case in the sample of languages that my doctoral student is looking at currently. And again, when we go back to Sranam, the structural and future slots were already filled by dedicated constructions. So again, a structural or a prospective strategy appears less likely. So we now looked into the first solution, namely assigning a non-present interpretation to a present perfective construction. The second solution, as I said, is to still create present time reference with a dynamic situation through imperfectivization. So by using a present imperfective or a progressive construction. And let me again use some diagrams to illustrate how this solution works. So what you see here is a dynamic situation with some boundaries, heterogeneous. Now, what the progressive or general imperfective does is impose internal perspective on this bounded situation. And what we get there within this scope is a more homogeneous, unbounded situation. So by imposing this internal scope, you're disregarding the original boundaries of a situation. And in order, let me make a comparison in order for you to understand how this imperfectivization really works. Imagine you're looking at a cow standing in the meadows relatively far away from you, And you see the contours of the cow, you see its tail, you see its head, you see that it's black and white. Now, the more you approach the cow as you walk towards the cow, the less you'll see of its contours. So you won't be seeing its tail anymore, you won't be seeing its head anymore. And if you come really close to the cow, you won't even be able to see its colors anymore. What you just see is a massive cow. So this is also what happens with verbs. If you zoom in on a situation, you make abstraction of its boundaries and of its heterogeneity. And what you end up with is, in fact, something that is a derived state. And recall that states are contractable. And so every segment of a state stands for the state in its entirety. So you can, there are no problems when you want to impose your temporal immediate scope within that derived state. So you can create coincidence with the time of speaking and the representative part of this derived state through imperfectivization. Then, before I conclude, I promised to say something about French, or Dutch or German for that matter, but I'm going to use an example from French, and in my book I also worked on French mostly. What do we get in these languages? Well, in these languages, the present tense is in fact aspectually ambiguous, and this can be illustrated in an example such as 17, Marie sourit toujours quand Paul arrive à la maison. Mary, well, this can be translated in two ways. Mary always smiles, perfective, or Mary is always smiling, imperfective. So what we get in languages such as French is that the present perfective paradox just really doesn't get the chance to arise, because this chameleon simple present takes on an imperfective guise, if you like, every time this is necessary. So every time it needs to imperfectivize, it can. So the present perfective paradox is just not relevant for a language such as French, with its aspectually ambiguous present tense. So to conclude, what we saw is that in many languages, but not all, the present tense cannot be used to refer to present time events, which I thought was, well, peculiar. And this incompatibility problem can be called the present perfective paradox. And languages appear to have developed two types of solution to this present perfective paradox. Either they assign a non-present interpretation to the combination of a present tense perfective aspect and an event. And depending on language internal factors, this can be a past interpretation, a structural interpretation, or a future interpretation. So we have three main strategies. More fine-grained perspectives may be possible as well when it comes to these strategies. But these are the main ones. And then the second solution is they can use an imperfectivizing construction to allow for present time reference. So to come full circle, maybe this Slavic present perfective, which is not used to refer to the present, is not that weird after all. So thank you very much. That was it. I'd be happy to address any questions you might have. So let me stop sharing, because otherwise I can't see you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Astrid, for this great talk on the present perfective paradox. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, comments. Anastasios, you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you very much. Most interesting. Well, I think you are, of course, right with everything you are suggesting, but my problem would still be not how much we can go to proceed to defining the content of a perfective morpheme, but equally how hard it would be and how justified we can be in defining the present tense morpheme as a morpheme that suggests coincidence with the moment of speech. So you have all this question that goes back to Bybee and Dahl, whether the present is a gram type and whether you can recognize present morphemes in the same manner as we do with perfective, imperfective, and all that. So I think we have both problems to address: how the perfective is defined, the way we talked about yesterday, in yesterday's plenary, as well as the content of the present morpheme. That should point to the possible solutions of the paradox. And then again, as you suggest, there are too many ways in which languages can solve the paradox, but there are both sides there, I think.
Yeah, and this is of course a challenge which I readily recognize. You have to use definitions of the categories you're working with that are useful across languages, and so this is what I try when I say, okay, the present tense indicates coincidence with the time of speaking. This is what I try to do. So I don't know whether you were suggesting that present tense doesn't exist, or that there's no such thing as a present tense gram type. Or
there have been suggestions. I'm not suggesting that, but I mean, we don't have to accept that as a given truth, that there is a present tense morpheme that has to mean coincidence with the moment of speech. In the same manner and to the same extent that we don't know what exactly that perfective in general can be. There's no, I mean, it's not just a problem for aspectology and defining the content of the perfective. You have a similar problem with defining the present tense morpheme.
So what you're basically saying is that we really have a very difficult job, right?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's true, absolutely. But I do try to define the. So I'd be happy to discuss other definitions. But what I try to do in my work is come up with a single definition for the perfective and for the present tense, and see how far we get. And thus far, this has worked. So for the perfective, and I know this is not standard, my definition is more epistemic, in the sense that I think we can call everything where you get, every situation where you get a full conceptualization of a situation, where you can fully and instantly identify a situation, that you get a perfective, and that's where you get this analogy between the simple present in English and the perfective in Slavic, which at face value are very, very different in many ways. But I try to see this analogy there. So I see the point, but I also think we get far with the definitions we're using. And to say that the present tense is not a relevant cross-linguistic gram type, I wouldn't agree with that. I think, it's such a cognitively salient category that I'd be very surprised if there are no clusters, to use Vladimir's word, if there's no clustering there. So yeah.
Okay. We do have a question by Anja Gatnar.
Yes, hello. Thanks for this great talk, Astrid De Wit. I have a question about the pragmatic use of present perfectives, because I'm interested in performatives. So is there, so I'm looking for Russian, and it's very interesting, but is there in Sranan something like that as well? So that it's a pragmatic use of this present perfective?
I'm not sure what you mean by a pragmatic use, but in Sranan, so the data are very limited, but it seems that zero can be used in these performative contexts.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, for example, politeness. So in performative, you have something like
I'd be very interested in knowing what happens exactly in Sranan when it comes to the performatives, but I can't answer your question simply because we don't have the data. So I don't know. So we conducted a study on performatives across languages, looking at these different types of context and how which aspectual constructions are used in different types of contexts. So, for instance, when you really want to emphasize something, when there's authority, and so on. But there was no Creole language in our sample that we could look into. So I have no answer to your question with regard to Strasbourg. Some other languages maybe, and it's true that many languages use perfective constructions, or at least what we see, it's not necessarily perfective, but what we see is that a great many languages use in performative contexts that construction which they're also using to refer to other situations that are fully and instantly identifiable at the time of speaking. When there's variation, this is indeed very often pragmatically motivated. In English, maybe a case in point. So it remains up to now a bit of a mystery why you can say in English, "I'm warning you," or I'm ordering you to go, but not "I'm promising to come." So why we should have this difference? That's maybe another topic.
We should do that. Thank you.
Okay, we have two questions by Patrick and Agnès, but there is a question by Östendahl in the YouTube chat, which I just copied. It's a kind of long question. I just copied it in the chat here. If you can see it, having to do with the semantic conflict, the moment of speech. Can you see, Astrid?
Shall I read? So the semantic conflict is between perfective aspect and reference to the moment of speech, yes. So there shouldn't be a problem when a present tense is used without referring to the moment of speech, which means a paradox is really that some languages use imperfective presence even in those cases, such as when Russian uses them in present tense narratives. Right. So what you're saying is when a present imperfective is used to refer to something that is not the present, this is a puzzle. Well, there are two sides of the same coin, maybe. It's true. Yeah, I don't think this goes against what I'm saying. Of course, interaction is a little bit difficult this way, but I don't think it goes against what I'm trying to say here, but it's true. I think, but general imperfectives are different from construction such as a progressive in this respect, in that general imperfectives, like the Slavic imperfective, is used in contexts where indeed you get full conceptualization of an event, like also in a performative context and so on. What you maybe see is a distribution between aspectotemporal constructions that are used for situations that are fully identifiable and then those that are not. I don't know whether this answers your question at all, but we can, of course, I should put on YouTube as well. We can continue chatting in the chat as well.
Okay. Patrick, you have a question?
Yes. Thanks, Astrid, for this beautiful talk. I'd had a lot of questions, but I'm gonna actually give a follow-up question concerning what our colleague Anastasios Tsangalidis just said about the fact that we should worry maybe about there being a special question with the present as a cross-linguistic category or label. It happens that industry and languages got a lot of these seemingly present tenses that can actually end up being past or future as well. And there's been a different take on these things. People have sort of come with the conclusion that the right label to use for these sort of things would be to call them either non-future or non-past, depending on the strategy they had adopted. And that seems to point into a different direction, in a sense, suggesting that we're talking about underspecified, temporal underspecified clusters, in a sense, which I think could make sense if you compare them to aspectual clusters found typologically. So that's one way of seeing the problem. But I think there's also a possibly an empirical question behind this, which is, where do these things stem from historically? I mean, we've got evidence in Australian languages from these guys originating in a sort of unmarked progressive or unmarked present tense, zero marked, morphologically null if you want. But there might be evidence for these things originating in other kinds of forms, in particular in terms of relative tenses. And so there might be a space for there being variation along these lines, and these things not necessarily being justifiably called the present, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. If let me rephrase what you're saying. So they might not be, historically not be present tenses, and therefore
in some cases yes, in some cases no. That's the point. So you'd have two sources that we can identify in Australian languages. Some are relative tenses, others seem to be sort of present.
Yeah, I do realize that what I call a present tenses has become a big mixed bag of stuff. But I think if you adopt this cross-linguistic perspective, it is very neat to see the pattern. And indeed, you get past, non-past languages, and you get future, non-future languages. But and I don't mean to gloss over the different ways in which we get to these different patterns, but what it boils down to is that currently we see the same patterns popping up across languages all over the world, maybe. I think it would be a pity not to see the analogy, not to see that, okay, in very different languages, we get some forms are used to refer to the present with stative or imperfective verbs, and then we get a past reading with dynamic verbs, let's say, irrespective of where this comes from. Now, I do realize that this is not maybe that the problem may indeed be, okay, are we dealing with a present tense here? It's never really been a present tense. But what I disagree with is to, again, shuffle the present tense uses with states or with imperfective construals just under the carpet, given what we see across languages. But it's nice that you point out this these different origins. I would gladly look into it.
I didn't suggest we should shuffle things under the carpet. What I'm saying that maybe we've got two different subtypes, and that I think shows in some Australian languages where clearly you've got subordination issues with these guys that reflect upon their stemming from relative tenses that does not exist with the other sort of structural patterns you showed. And I think, therefore, there should be a difference made, possibly. I don't know whether that exists in other sorts of languages, but in Australian languages, I guess that would be the case.
That's very interesting. Thank you for pointing that out. We should look into that further. I never realized that. So nice. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Agnes, you do have a question, and then there will be a follow-up in the chat by Stendhal. Agnes.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Astrid, for this great talk and for the the theory that you have provided. I would have many questions, but maybe I will just concentrate on one of them. My question would be about the present perfective construction in English, and especially the performative uses and the historical uses. My question is, how present is a historical present? How present is a performative? You mentioned that the historical present or the performative use are identifiable with the time of speaking. Is the time of speaking really something that is essential when you use a historical present? Well, in some cases it can be, but I think that in narrative uses, for example, there is no connection with the time of speaking, and any attempt to connect the past event with the time of speaking will be problematic. You wouldn't say, well, 2 days ago she falls, or 2 days ago she misses the train, and then she decides to go back home. So in terms of connection with the present, do you think that these special uses, performative uses, historical uses of the present are still connected with the present? So what is the real connection between these present perfective constructions and the present, and is the present as well, in terms of temporality, is it still relevant to speak about the present time in that case? Is it really what matters when we have to deal with such uses?
Thanks for that question. I think you can split the range of uses of the or the range of exceptional uses of the simple present into two main groups. You have those where the direct connection with the time of speaking is still relevant, very relevant. And in fact, performatives are really a case in point. You cannot be more present than you are when you're using a performative. If I say, I promise I'll stop in 2 minutes from now, by saying I promise, so the speech event is the event, really. The promising and the speaking is the same thing. So there's even no distinction between the speech event and the event that is being reported. So there, I think the connection is very straight. However, when it comes to, and the same goes for instance, for but less so maybe, but for sports commentaries where you follow up. So De Bruyne shoots, Hazard scores. There you follow this sport event very closely, and you construe this as fully and exactly coinciding with the time of speaking. However, then you have those other uses, such as historical present uses, which are not actually coinciding, of course, with the time of speaking, but they're construed as, and then maybe indeed you can make some more abstraction of now, but they're construed as, you imagine them in some sort of virtual reality, and you construe them as though you replay them in front of you. And you can even find examples, because you were saying you wouldn't use a simple present in a context like 2 days ago. I'm sitting on my porch and this guy comes up to me and says he's my brother, where in fact you do. You really make events more lively, even though you use a past time adverbial. You make events more lively by using a simple present in contexts such as this, and the only effect is you're replaying it as though it happened. It happens before you. But of course, the most important thing is not the time, in my view, but the epistemic component in this respect, namely the fact that you can conceive of these situations in their entirety. So it's true that the connection between the now, or the temporal connection, is just less relevant for examples such as this. So I hope this answers your question a little bit. I think maybe.
Yeah,
Thank
maybe
you.
the follow-up.
The chat, the performatives. some Slavic languages do use perfective present tense narratives. Yes, especially Western Slavic languages, right? But again, I'm not the Slavicist among this group. So yeah, I think when you look at individual distributions between, well, you have to look at individual languages also. Why in English is in narrative sometimes the progressive use and sometimes the simple present use. Why in performatives do we also sometimes get a progressive in English? And the same holds for Slavic languages, where indeed you get probably pragmatic motivations for using a present perfective in a performative context. But I don't know exactly how this related to the previous point. And I don't know whether we have time to go into that. I'll just maybe open. Can anyone maybe post a link to the YouTube channel in the chat, so then I can open the chat as well and we can continue there, because I think I should stop.
Yeah, I put the link. I'll put the link. Okay. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, Christelle just did it. You have it in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you.
We can have a few questions. We have like 3-4 minutes. I do have one, if I may. Okay.
Of course.
What do you? Thanks for your talk. Great, super talk. I have a question on examples in English which have always puzzled me with the simple present tense things. You say that even as we speak with as, even as we speak, this is going on. Something's going on as we move forward. Here we do not have, if I follow your train of thought, we do not have access to the whole configuration, because these are activity verbs. So when I say even as we speak, it means even as we are speaking, but still we say even as we speak. So what do you make of that? Would you consider that as exceptions, or how do you accommodate that in the system? And it's quite you hear these things in English.
There are subclauses, of course, and they are not maybe. So I never thought about these specific cases, I must admit. But even as we speak, well, the answer along the lines of, I mean, if to give an answer along the lines of what we find with conditionals is would maybe work. So you are with even, so you're with using something like even or if, you're conjuring up a mental space, if you like, another space where you are construing this as something that you do know in its entirety as true, but it's true that that from a, well, actually this may be a very nice example, because if you adopt a purely temporal approach to aspect, examples are very puzzling indeed, because you have a sense of ongoingness. I mean, it's really very evident that this is an ongoing situation, and still you would be using a present, simple present in those cases. So even as we speak, again, might be analogous to if we speak. She always says this or that, where the if, well, conjures up a virtual space, a conditional space, which you construe as knowing in its entirety. I would have to, it's a good question, I would have to think about these cases, which are indeed puzzling but nice. There's a stronger sense of formality even in even as we speak, even as we are speaking. Formality may also play a role, of course. So if you really want to talk about the progressive, I can open this. But it's true that the simple present is generally used in contexts where that are construed as some sort of fixed. structural. They're just there. There's not really much discussion about it. Even as we are speaking, it's more, well, let's say phenomenal. It can still, you know, it's looser, it can still go away, it can still change, and so on. So it's also why we get the tentative uses with performatives and so on. So that's again another story, the progressive.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'll have to think about that. It's a nice example. Thank you.
Okay.